How's it going, everyone? Welcome back. In today's video we're going to be covering the much requested how to create minimal house basslines like the pros. So this one continues on from the previous ones we did on chord stabs and pads, covering arguably one of the most important elements in the genre, is that kind of driving bassline that kind of keeps the groove going and kind of, in my opinion, is probably the most important element. So once again, we're going to kind of split it down into the main kind of elements that you need to consider to kind of perfect that, which are firstly your sounds and your plugins, then your MIDI patterns, and then your audio effects. So these all work in tandem, like you can't really have one without the other. But if you feel like something is perhaps lacking in your skill set, then there will be like timestamps for the 3 different sections. So if you want, you can't just jump ahead, but I very much recommend trying to watch as much as possible to basically get that understanding into how to make your basslines a lot better and get them up to like pro standard. So for part 1, we're essentially going to focus on the sounds and the plugins that you might use to kind of design these bass sounds. Obviously there's so many different potential ones you might use, but this section will basically aim to cover that. And I've kind of put this first before the MIDI, which is a bit different to the other 2 tutorials I did. And the reason I've kind of done that is basically because I kind of find that it helps to basically choose your sound first and then draw in the pattern. Because as we'll see later, for like MIDI patterns, not every sound will suit every MIDI pattern and vice versa. Like you basically have to nail down one of them and then choose. And I find it can be easier to write that pattern once you've selected a usable sound, as opposed to selecting a sound when you've done the pattern, which might be easier with, say, like the pads and the chords examples. Just because there's so much variation within the different kind of bass sounds you might go for. So that's essentially what we're going to do. And firstly, before even looking at the bass itself, you kind of want to make sure you have the foundations right with the kind of kick. So got this thumpy kick here. There's loads you can do. You can take like raw sounds, you can process them with like drum busts and all that kind of thing. Just make sure you have a kick that has like a bit of presence, otherwise it'll get lost. Like you kind of want it to be like really definitive when mixed with the bass. The distortion and saturation can help to really like add that to like basically make a kick really like clicky and that kind of thing. So you kind of want to consider the kick as well. And then with regards to like the sounds, there's just like so many different sounds you can use. So I'll recommend them with pretty much everything because not everyone has access to these plugins. And these plugins I recommend aren't always the be all and end all. But Ableton stock is actually like better than you might think. So if you're like quite good at sound design, you could go in and basically load a blank patch and basically kind of shape it yourself. But a lot of the times when you do this, if your skills in sound design aren't quite great, the sounds can be quite weak and can kind of stand out in the mix for the wrong reasons. So we're using an analog. And kind of as I showed with the chord stabs, there's like various parameters you might use. So there's definitely potential with like Ableton stock, and something I'd actually urge you to do is go into the kind of presets within each like analog operator, and you can even use wavetable, and basically just find something you quite like the look of. So if I create a chain here, there's like loads of really good ones, and I've actually like started to kind of categorize them as well. Maybe you have to move down an octave. So it's like a lot of good sounds, and I think something that can throw a lot of people off with regards to sounds, I'll touch on it now, but it's also with regards to like MIDI, is playing back at the right octave. So you basically would have like your middle C is probably there, but like this pattern shown is quite high. So you're actually probably wanting to audition your sounds further down around the C1, maybe if you're like subby C2. If it's a bit higher, it obviously depends on the sound, like they're obviously like pitched at different octaves and that kind of thing, but basically have a way to audition your sounds, whether that's through like a keyboard with an octave button or like our quick octave tool I'll talk about with regards to MIDI, because the octave you play back at matters in influencing your kind of how good you think a sound is will be influenced by the octave you play it back at. So don't always play back a middle C if possible. So Ableton stock is always like a good option, and if you're looking through these presets, or if you're struggling to design these sounds and you're not really hearing anything that stands out, we do actually have a kind of preset bank which is specifically tailored towards like minimal house for bass. So it's this here, and I believe this preset actually we've basically got like different presets. I'll just load this one. It's basically got like loads of different bass presets, which sound really good, and like they're really easy to just quickly use. They'll sound different because this chain's on. So if you want a collection of like really good sounds, I think there's about 30 odd presets in there, which also includes like the decent kicks as well I was talking about. If you want all those, they're available from the website. It's the Minimal House Bass Preset Pack. So yeah, Ableton stock, don't disregard it. It's a very good starting point, but sometimes you just have to play back at different kind of octaves to be able to hear the usability of them, as well as maybe like setting up effects chains to kind of addition them, because there's a lot that can influence your decisions on whether something sounds good or not, and it's all about like context. So the octave's a good way, but kind of master bass chain can also be one way, but we'll talk about that with regards to audio effects. So something else you could do for the instruments is using like sampled bass hits. So the Simpler is an amazing device, as I'm sure you'll know, but you can essentially like use the samples in your library, and basically the Simpler provides an easy way to kind of manipulate that. So you can adjust the start point, go for the normal settings, and it basically gives you everything you need to manipulate the sample without the kind of requirement for another plugin or the complexity and lack of like direction that you might have within a plugin, because a plugin can often be overwhelming and give you too many options in that regard. So sampler would be good. You can basically like I'll type in bass C, you need to make sure the note is in scale. That's quite good. And I'll just test it with MIDI generation. Actually pitched as well. And you'll just hear when I put different octaves in, how different it sounds. Like each sound has its kind of octave band that it operates within. So this one's like a bit of a higher bass, so that when you transpose it lower, it doesn't really work. That's the thing you have to consider with these sounds when you're using them and auditioning them. So sample basses is another straightforward way. In terms of like my external plugin recommendations, there's loads, but I've kind of picked out a few that I'd maybe go for. So my top 5 would be Bluetooth, and I'll just show, they've basically got like analog digital bass banks. These are the ones I tend to look at. Obviously you can try other things, but best to stay, like I was saying, for other tutorials, it's best to stay within certain categories, and for bass, you might as well stay within bass. Massive, not so much. Actually, I removed that from the list. Top 4 would be Trillion, Diva, Subboom, and Bluetooth. Massive I've got in here because there's a specific preset that I like to reuse from my Aaron Volta. So I wouldn't keep it in there specifically for bass, but Massive can also work, and that Massive lends itself to other genres, so it's a good one anyway. And then other ones I'd consider, Mini Monster 2 is quite a good one. Basically, like, I believe it's like a Moog emulation, and there's actually quite a lot of bass presets in there. Don't know if this is actually updated because it looked different last time. The Mini Monster is a good one anyway. SH101, Vacuum Pro, and Waltz of Bass is alright as well. That's by Iglesias. So there's so many bass plugins, just take your pick really. If I had to recommend one, it would probably be Bluetooth or Subboom. I know that's 2. Diva, quite good for like a general synth. And then Trillion's probably like your higher end option. And Trillion's like probably like more realistic sounds as well, I'd say. I can play this. Because you get like synth bass. You also get like bass guitar. So loads of different plugin options really. Like take your pick. As long as you're kind of choosing the right sounds and the right categories, you should be able to find something usable. And because we're doing it in the order of choosing the sound first, it gives us a bit more freedom to actually find something that we really like, as opposed to when we have the MIDI in and we're trying to tailor the sound to that pattern. So it's kind of the reason I like to put the choosing the sounds first part for bass first. So with regards to like, those are the plugins. With regards to like the sound design, you shouldn't really overthink it. Essentially, like I showed before with the other like sound I had, and essentially you basically just want to have like your frequency, like your classic filter things, your ADSR, your volume, and those are like the main ones. You'll see when I go into Trillion, I've kind of got those kind of mapped out, and when I go to Blue, got the frequency. So I can quickly strip the sound back, because a lot of these sounds can be quite full. You've got the resonance and then envelope. So I think filters are definitely the most important for bass sounds, and then anything else like ADSR and those kind of sounds can really help you shape the bass, depending on if you want a longer bass or like a shorter, snappy one, which is probably more common in minimal house. Like, it kind of depends on your kick. If your kick's really long, you probably want your bass to be short. If you want your kick's really short, you could probably afford to make your bass that bit shorter, longer, I mean. So for filter design, for sound design, ADSR and filters are like your main kind of things to focus on. And then something else which we'll talk about briefly, like, is basically like how you can audition these sounds. So a lot of the time you'll be skimming through these sounds and you'll probably be like clicking through and you might do it on the right plugin. We'll do it on Blue. So that, I've been able to find a sound a lot quicker because I kind of know where I'm looking. But say you're looking in these banks and you are just skimming through and you're just like, nothing sounds good, you'll probably be hitting the root note. So say you're looking through these sounds and you're just hitting the note. You might be applying a pattern to test it, along with like a kick, which I'd very much recommend. What I'll do is I'll just find a part which I'll just loop to this section. So you might be playing along and you might be like struggling to kind of hear that sound. So the thing I always recommend doing is basically loading an octave transposer tool. So this is one that we have on the website. I believe it's free. And it kind of provides an alternative to, like, say, if you had a keyboard that has like an octave button. So you can quickly audition how the bass is going to sound at different octaves, because each preset will be pitched differently. So one bass preset might be a sub and be intentionally pitched down 1 to 2 octaves, or it could be like pitched up slightly for like that higher bass. So this sounds fine, but it sounds even better down here. So basically, auditioning at those different octaves is a really useful thing you can do when you're going to choose your sounds. Because, like I said, these sounds, the issue with a lot of these sounds is they don't have that context. You'll be opening up the sound and you'll literally just have the sound as it is, how they've designed it without thinking about you, like your music. It's up to you to kind of shape it and figure out what's actually going to work. And you can do that with like octave transposer MIDI tool, basically audition that. And you can also do it with like our rough effects train. So we'll touch on that in a bit. Just kind of like basic effects for your bass that you can just instantly load and you'll know it'll work. So like things like compression, EQ, sidechain, filters, all those things. So that can be a useful thing to do when you're auditioning those sounds. And the final thing I kind of want to talk about, which we'll maybe get onto a bit with MIDI, but it's fitting for this section because I literally have it set up like this, is layering. So basically having like a pattern which is split into two basses to kind of add. So pretty much on every bass channel, in every bass group I'll have like a main bass and a sub of some kind, and it will really help to kind of batten it up, batten it, I'm going insane, batten it up. So essentially having different instruments and different sounds in different instruments and sounds in the one chain, and then having them play at the same time. Obviously you have to be careful to kind of craft space for each, but you could easily layer like a sub and a main bass together, just for like to fatten up the sound essentially. That is essentially going to be it for part 1 of the sounds and the plugins you might use for the bass. So in the next section, we're essentially going to talk about kind of like MIDI patterns and how you can program those really groovy bass lines. So the next part I kind of want to dive into is going to be kind of MIDI patterns. So this is something that I think people often struggle with, but it doesn't even have to be as complex as some people make it, especially considering the fact that the genre we're working with is minimal house. So these bass lines can be as stripped back as you like, and can often even be carried by like a lot of the other elements. So you don't even have to make them overly complex, and you tend to find that often the more complex ones actually don't even work as well in the genre. So there's not really like any set rules to the patterns. You can literally go as basic to as complex as you want. But we'll kind of try and cover these. So in terms of patterns, like it's kind of weird doing a tutorial on like how to do these patterns because, like I was saying, there is no set rules. Often they are literally just feeling based. So I kind of touched on this briefly when I was talking about the sounds. Like you can literally, I'll get to this. You can literally like play along on the keyboard and kind of intuitively find something that works and start developing it, of course, within the editor. So I could literally just start with the root note, and there's a few like tricks I do just by nature, and I can even remember most of them, but I could literally just start with the root note. I could literally just start with this, and then I basically have a pattern. So I literally already have a bass pattern, and that was purely feeling based, and I literally just wrote that in 10 seconds, so it's not the best bass line in the world. But it just goes to show, like, you can be as straightforward as you want. You can pick out notes. So, like, it can be as complex or as basic as you want, is essentially my point here. And this kind of brings me on to the next point with regards to basses, is like, just to show, like, I think a good place to start with the bass is when you have those other ideas down. So you'll have the kick, and let me just get to this. I'll move that there. And so basically, if you're in the position where you're building your track and you've literally just got the kick, it can be hard to find something that works unless you're like amazing at playing in your bass lines. It can be hard to like basically draw in a bass line that has a really nice groovy rhythm, and like just using the kick on the 1, 2, 3, and the 4 as your like reference point for that bass line isn't like the best way to do it. So essentially, my recommendation here is to try and start your bass a bit later in the process when your other ideas are beginning to take more shape. So that could be your drums. I've got these drums which are fairly straight, but there's a few more groovy elements within like the loops. And like when I was playing that bass line in, I was trying to hear some of the gaps within the kind of percussion and stuff to see if I can actually show it visually. Here, you've got this. So you'll hear some of the notes are on the main beat, like the first one. But when you see like the actual, like how they line up, so having that kind of developed drum groove can help me with the rhythm of the bass line, which I think is one of the most important elements. I'd actually arguably say the rhythm of the notes is more important than the notes itself. Obviously you have to keep it in scale, but so you could do it with drums, or say if you have some melodic ideas, often it helps because you can literally hear a bass line within those melodic elements. So you could perhaps start with like a synth loop and then write the bass line and then get rid of the synth loop if it's not original, and there's your idea. So basically, with regards to like the order you write it in, it can help to have something more established in terms of an idea as opposed to just your kick. That could be with the drums or the synth elements or anything else. And if I just show you what I mean, like I did this bass line here. So I wrote those bass lines, but if I'd started with these, you wouldn't even be able to tell like you wouldn't be able to tell which idea came first because they kind of sound like they fit so well. I genuinely couldn't even remember what came first, but you could hear like how I might use that idea, the music loop, to inform the bass line. And this one here. So that just goes to show you like how much better your bass lines can be because you're using more established ideas. So I'll move on from that one. With regards to like MIDI programming, if you have access to a keyboard, I definitely recommend giving it a try, like playing, because you can obviously like program in like this, but like I wrote it in like under 20 seconds, but it sounds a bit flat and like unnatural in places. Not really got many of the velocity changes and that kind of thing that playing in live has. So I find that playing in is sometimes a lot easier to kind of get that sense of like how good your groove should be and that kind of thing. So it's something I would definitely try if you're comfortable doing that. Obviously draw it in if you're less comfortable, but try playing it in and then making those tweaks. I've got this here. And something that's a cool trick when it comes to bass is essentially doing like question and answer. So like trying to separate the top line with a lower line. So that can be within the clip itself. So you could have sorry if you can hear background noise. So I could have so essentially you could think of it as like you've got the lower melody down here and then everything above C3 is like the higher one. So you've essentially just got like two separate lines that are responding to one another, and it helps to add so much groove to your bass lines. Essentially, you basically want to have like different lines which could play at different points. So you could separate this into two layers, or you could literally have it within the MIDI. And I'll just do this. And what I will do is have it for this. So you've basically got two melodies within your bass, and when you bring them both together, and just to show I could have you basically have that same pattern spread across two different sounds. So have a lower and a higher one. Just do that, and then we could mute the bottom notes for the higher one. Obviously you need to like refine the sounds. So I could do that, or I could also literally just keep it like really simple when it comes to like the sub. So there's loads of ways you can split your bass up to basically make it more interesting with regards to patterns and layering and that kind of thing, and that's just one of many examples. I'll literally just go back to this clip as well, just for like more kind of programming advice. Octave jumps is another one that's really cool that you can try. So basically, like you could take notes from the pattern and just move them up and down an octave. So it sounds a bit random because I'm doing it at speed, but that's generally like the process you might consider. Is basically playing around with Q&A melodies. You can move them up and down octaves. You can then start to like get into like the velocity territory, and you can maybe apply some groove up here. Use like a groove preset, and that will shift the rhythm and make it a bit more groovy. But you have to make sure that's consistent across like all your drums. Something else you can try is, like I was saying about the playing in, is you can try moving the BPM down to like a slower BPM, like 80 or 90 or something. Which basically allows you to focus more on the notes you're playing as opposed to the rhythm. Because a lot of the time it's hard to play these kind of bass patterns in because of the speed you're working at. So if you bring it down to around like 80 or 90, I'll put it down to 80. And I'll turn this sub off. We'll see how this works. Played a wrong note there. Wasn't what I was wanting. Hang on. Okay, so those are the notes I want. And you can tell they're off grid already, so you could quantize them. So that is what I was wanting to play in. And I could now take it back to the original tempo, which I think was, we'll just do 127. bass line, which I could change up. I could then do the velocity. So that's essentially how I would do like MIDI programming. Like the approach obviously changes every time, and it reflects on like the different elements in the track and the inspiration I have at any given moment. But it's more or less the same, like literally just playing how I think it should be, like what's in my head. Basically playing off that feeling, like I was saying, get something. And there's loads of different things you can do with regards to MIDI programming, but a lot of it is literally just about instinct. Like I've literally just programmed 2 pretty usable MIDI patterns in, and like I said previously, like pick a good sound and then just go with the flow. And then various other methods you can use with regards to MIDI. If you're not so confident on the patterns, obviously you can go down the MIDI generation route. So quick recap: sequencer plus scale device plus like ultra transpose addition, one I talked about. And then you could basically have that MIDI generation kind of sequencer up, and then you could start additioning your sounds. I find that the sting device way of generating patterns can often be a bit hectic for this kind of style, but you can quite easily trim down the density. So sequencers is one way. Another way would be to basically find a kind of bass loop. Just see if I can find one. Got this one here, pretty clean. And then basically just convert melody to new MIDI track, and you'll get pretty imperfect result, which we'll just dismiss that. We'll bring that up, and see, the algorithm isn't amazing at picking these things up, but it can do a fairly good job. It's actually done a fairly good job of that. And then all you have to do with those kind of MIDI sounds is just find a usable preset for it. So that's another idea, is essentially just using the audio to new MIDI feature on like bass loops. And the final one is kind of an unusual one actually, that I wouldn't normally use, but it can throw out some like unexpected surprises. And that is essentially using like MIDI loops. So it doesn't even have to be bass specific MIDI loops. It can literally be anything, like rhythmic, because you basically can take the rhythm and build on it. I'm just trying to find, I'll probably not be able to find the original pack, but hang on, let's see. So you basically can take like MIDI packs. Trying to find the one. There was one that I used recently, and it worked out really well. Probably not. Oh, actually, yeah, it's here. It is this like massive collection. I don't remember where I found it for the life of me, but it's basically like MIDI drums, and normally it just doesn't make sense like melodically, because a lot of these MIDI patterns are designed for drums. But if you put it on like something like a sub bass, it probably won't. And then you just take like one note. You've got something to play with, basically. I just mute some notes, make it more minimal. So it's not the best example, but using MIDI loops is definitely another way of like getting inspiration. So that's pretty much going to conclude the kind of MIDI generation stage of the process. In the next stage, we're essentially going to talk about like audio effects and your basic processing and maybe like more creative processing and all that kind of stuff. So basically how you can really perfect that low end. So for part 3, the final thing I kind of want to talk about is the audio effects and any kind of creative processing you might consider on your bass. So of course this can take loads of different directions, and I would urge you to explore different kind of effects, but we're kind of going to touch on the kind of standard processing you might put on these sounds and explore a few other creative options, as well as how you can like really solidify your low end with group processing. So to begin with, I basically want to talk about the kind of typical effects chain, and that is essentially this here. So I've done this for loads of different sounds, but for the bass, I typically have like my go-to effects that just I know work for the majority of sounds, and it can be a good kind of reference point as well. Like I was talking about when you're trying to audition those sounds, having something like this already on your channel can be a kind of a good way to audition them. But to obviously be careful that the chain isn't affecting the sound too much, rather enhancing it. But it can definitely help you to kind of contextualize how good those sounds are. So on that chain, I have a few effects which we'll talk about. This is obviously a more developed version of that, but I essentially have a utility, and we'll just go back to this. And we'll go to my main. So I have a utility to keep it in mono. I have an EQ, and that's depending on what kind of bass it is. This is like more of a top bass. If I want to utilize the sub, I'll have it trim that there. And then I could have high pass as well, which I've got on a separate EQ, a high cut, sorry, and basically trim it down. You need to think what kind of bass you want, but having that EQ with the two cuts quickly available, I think I have it further up. yeah, I have it here on a filter, but basically having that to quickly kind of shape the sound that I'm looking for is helpful. Compression. Basically to give it a bit of consistency. Sidechain, because the majority of the time I want because I basically want the pick pretty much ducking all the time. If it's not on, it can work not being sidechained, like you don't have to always sidechain it, but I like to sidechain it pretty much the majority of the time. But sidechain and then saturation just to kind of thicken the sound up, especially when it's so low in the mix with regards to like the frequency. Like it basically helps to make it more present, because when you have like those low end sounds, when you're dealing with them, some things can be lost. So it can help to basically add characteristics to your sound in the higher end and help it cut through the mix. So I've got those, and I normally have either saturation or distortion of some kind. And the final thing I have, which isn't on my addition chain, but it's on my kind of template, is the kind of parallel compression. So it looks like this. You basically set up a chain which looks like this. Infinite ratio, everything else is up to you really. Wet 100%. And then it basically allows me to instantly fatten up a sound. Kind of works in the same way as having the compressor there. So that's kind of like my addition chain. Like if I just switch it off, it's very subtle changes, but it's changes that I know can help me hear the sound a lot better than if it's just raw. And I think that's the reason why you might listen to a lot of like stock sounds and just dismiss them, is because you're basically hearing those raw sounds that I'll use the word again and again. I keep using it and just don't have that context. Whether that be the context in the mix, like they might get lost in the mix, or it could just be the context of having sounds that take them from those raw sounds to more professional quality sounds that can actually be utilized in your mix. So these kind of chains, I'd recommend setting them up once you kind of know what your go-to setup is, and basically saving them and load them every time. So those are kind of like the individual processing channels I'd very much urge you to try. With regards to like creative effects, there's loads of different options. So my first one is Filter Freak. So filters are really cool for like spicing up your bass, and Filter Freak kind of adds filter modulation as well. So you can basically just take a filter and you're like basically sweeping and it's moving along. Kind of the equivalent of bumping this up, but more random. You've got like loads of different options here. This is one of my favorite presets. So you can basically like control different filter movement and have it like sweeping up those higher frequencies, because if you crank this up and sweep up, a lot of like the hidden gems of bass sounds, you might not think it, but a lot of them, if you pick the right sound, are along these kind of regions. Especially like when you crank the resonance up. So it's like something cool you can do is basically get creative with like sculpting that sound. The Filter Freak's definitely one I'd urge you to try. And just different filter options. if you want your sound to move and be more interesting. The next ones I'd urge you are like, I've grouped it here as basically under the word definition based plugins. So you might be familiar with like erosion as an effect, where you can kind of add digital artifacts to your sound. And you'll notice a lot of similarities with these plugins that I'm recommending and these audio effects, in that they're helping to basically add high end to your bass to kind of let it stand out more in the mix, as opposed to being drowned out further down. So it's kind of like a key theme here, is you're trying to add a bit of texture to your high end to basically liven up your bass and make it more audible. We'll turn the filter off. So you can make it like sound really digital. If you go and listen to a lot of like Halter's tracks, you'll definitely hear this technique with like the sine wave related bass. And it makes it sound like really digital, and you can experiment with like noise. Basically make it really dirty and horrible, deliberately. So erosion's one that can help to add. Third party one, which I really like, is like Decimort 2. It's like a bit crusher. I'll go to a preset that actually works. And you can basically resample it to like make it really bit crushed. There's a lot of like fine tuning you have to do with these kind of things, because you can quite easily make the sound worse. Like, they are plugins that you use to deliberately degrade the sound, but you can get those like little bits of ear candy. And in this case, the erosion so that's like something you can use to add definition to the sound. The next kind of category group I've used is like presence. These are all just like words that we use to describe things. It's kind of hard a lot of the time to describe them, but there's a lot of overlap. And there's kind of 3 plugins that I'd recommend for this. The R-Bass is the one that a lot of people recommend. And what it basically does is it kind of takes your original signal and makes it more intense. Like, you can basically boost at a certain frequency. I can pick like, I'll just stick with 80 because 80 is quite a good. I can basically boost the intensity at 80 hertz. So you basically got R-Bass. Max Bass does something similar, where you basically have the option to boost a signal and it's like duplicated with the original. I can hear the original bass, I can hear the max bass version, and I can blend them. So it's basically ways to like fatten up your bass, which is often one of the main issues that happens with like bass lines. CLA is kind of like an amp where you can boost different parameters, boost the sub, add distortion, so it's kind of like multi-effects. So different plugins which do something very similar, but their whole purpose is adding like a bit of presence. And then Capitator is like saturator. You can basically use to add drive and like alter the tone. Make it more dark, make it brighter. So at the end of the day, a lot of these plugins are literally just making that sound brighter. But there's loads of different like options you have really when it comes to these things, and those are kind of like the more creative plugins I'd maybe consider referencing when it comes to basslines, but you can get very far with literally just like the basic effects that I showed previously. So that's kind of how I'd process the bass on like the individual channels, and the obvious exception, depending on what kind of bass we're going for, would be just the EQ cuts. If it was a sub, remove all the high, and vice versa for like top basses. And then it makes your life when layering a lot easier. The final thing, which I might actually do a completely different tutorial on it, basically with regards to like mastering your low end and like when it comes to like mixing. So essentially group processing. So this isn't something I always do, but I find it can like really help to basically glue that low end together and really get it sitting well in the mix. So essentially what you want to do is basically have your kick and bass grouped together, and I'll just do that now. I'm just moving it down because I don't want it in another folder. So basically have your kick and bass grouped together for like low end bass. And then something that's often omitted is like group processing, but I just think it makes like so much difference when it comes to like really getting your low end to stand out. So you can obviously load like one of the main ones I would load is like glue compressor. Basically just to make sure they're really hitting. And I'm just doing like this like really rough for now, but and you could maybe like saturate it, EQ it, press it and that kind of thing. Like there's loads you can do, but basically adding that kind of final glue with like a low end group and then processing it together as one source. And I'll not get into like the full process because I think that is probably a good place to kind of leave it and maybe do another tutorial on that another time, but you can literally make them one unified source and it really helps with your mix. So yeah, that is pretty much going to conclude that one. I hope it gave you a bit more of a well-rounded idea into how to approach the creation of like basslines in Minimal House, from the sounds, the plugins, how to program the MIDI, and then finally how to process sounds. So it's intended to be a kind of rather general overview which you can then go and build on. But I hope it's given you a better perspective into all three kind of elements and get you closer to, basically gets you closer to creating basslines for Minimal House in the style of the pros. So yeah, I'm gonna leave that one there. If you enjoyed, remember to hit like, remember to subscribe for more. Check out all the links below for any related resources, including the project file. And I'll see you in the next one.